Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 5 of our story. Isn't this the most exciting story? So here we are, and if you haven't heard part 1, part 2, part 3 or 4, please click on the description because you don't want to miss out on this fabulous story. So let's continue with part 5 of our story tonight.
Did I not tell you Sheila Partridge is unscrupulous? See what I mean? That woman will say anything to get you to do her bidding. Of course Sweet Pea Cottage is not haunted. Believe me, I would know all about it if that were the case. I think Sheila Partridge cannot wait to get commission checks for offloading our properties to hungry buyers. I know at the estate agents the people working under her love to hate her.
But are you absolutely sure the cottage isn't haunted? I asked. It's just strange, rather idiosyncratic things have happened there. The television and lights have switched themselves on and off. Last night something was pounding on the door so loudly, I thought they were going to break the door down. And last night when I returned home from dinner with the Partridges, I was absolutely sure I'd locked the front door, but it was unlocked when I returned home, and there was garbage strewn all over my kitchen floor. It was more than a little weird.
Maybe you thought you had locked it, said Zack kindly. And as for electric problems, maybe you should get your electrics checked. And as for the banging at your front door, there was quite a fierce wind blowing last night. In my experience, when the wind is howling, everything can rattle.
You're probably right, I said, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief that my concerns about the cottage were clearly unfounded. Well, it's so good to meet you, Zack. I'll love you and leave you. Thanks for the coffee and for putting my mind at rest. And I'm dreadfully sorry about your loss.
Thanks, said Zack. It's tough having lost Tina. But I hope she's found peace where she is. Are you sure you don't want me to give you a lift back to your cottage? It really is no problem.
I'd actually enjoy the walk back, I said. The exercise will do me good.
Don't be a stranger, Freya, said Zack. You know you can pop in any time you like. I will welcome the visit. It's been incredibly good to meet you. You do remind me of my late sister. A friend of hers is a friend of mine.
Ditto, I said, giving Zack a friendly nod.
Why don't you walk through the woods, said Zack. It's a nice shortcut to your cottage, if you take the Gregory path. It's clearly marked.
I might just do that, I said, secretly wondering if walking through the woods was actually a good idea, as I was convinced that when I'd inadvertently bumped into Mrs. Partridge that I'd been stalked by a Bigfoot. But the shadowy figure had been so ambiguous, I wasn't sure what I'd seen, and I would have felt foolish mentioning such thoughts to Zack. But I also had seen those yellow eyes staring at me from the woods, always watching, and I don't mind admitting I had felt very afraid. I decided it would be good to follow the Gregory path through the trees, which I noticed was clearly marked. I was not going to be dictated by my fear. That was no way to live. I was not going to be intimidated by Sheila Partridge, or by what I perceived might be a Bigfoot in the woods. Soon I was on the Gregory path, my mind swimming with all the details that Zack had told me about Tina Crosscrow, and her perennial struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder that finally got too much of a burden for her. Thank you, Tina, I whispered to myself, for giving me this brand new start. And don't you worry about Sheila Partridge. She's not going to get her grubby hands on Sweet Pea Cottage. My silent promise was witnessed by the trees, as my heavy boots grazed the earthen floor of the woods, pulverizing the leaf litter beneath my rubber soles like a pestle and mortar. It was such a prepossessing day, and I was glad of this pleasant walk. I was beginning to feel rather invigorated and refreshed, enjoying the warm feeling of the sun filtering through the trees and warming the back of my neck and shoulders, as if an air dryer was blowing over me. It was a pleasant experience, and all the shrubs, fern, and leafy forest fauna were washed in a shimmering golden glaze that was almost ethereal. There was a slight breeze blowing that caused some of the boughs of the trees to dance, as they rustled their leaves like hundreds of lofty cheerleaders shaking their pom-poms. I could hear the bird song high up in the trees, A pretty collection of trills, warbles and whistles. Then it happened again. The dreadful feeling that I was not alone, and that something was watching me. I felt as if eyes were burrowing in the back of my skull, which sent pinpricks of unease crawling all over my body. Someone was there. I knew they were there. I could feel a powerful presence. I wasn't imagining it. Yet when I looked through the trees, nothing was there. It was so frustrating. I called out through the woods, "Hello! Hello!" And the disembodied, haunting echo of my urgent voice returned right back to me, amidst the silent whispers of the leaves and the trills of the birds. I continued along my way, ever certain that I was being clandestinely stalked, but nothing was ever there. Was I going completely mad? Were Sheila Partridge's ominous suggestions about Sweetpea Cottage being haunted? Had they woven a powerful thread of self-doubt in my mind that was persuading my scepticism to believe in things that were not really there? I was now envisaging a Bigfoot in the woods, along with ghostly spectres playing with the electrics at the cottage and banging on the front door in the middle of the night obtrusively. I needed to pull in the reins of my fear, as if breaking in an unbridled horse. In my leisurely, pleasant walk back to Sweetpea Cottage, I could not help finding that I was beginning to feel indignant toward Sheila Partridge for putting all these outlandish thoughts into my head, just so that she could get my cottage off my hands, and a nice commission cheque for the sale. By all accounts, Sheila was piling on the pressure with Zack Crosscrow, trying to persuade him to sell the White Swan as well, when I could see he was very attached to his charming cottage. Zack was right. The woman was unscrupulous, but at this point in time, I was not actually aware of just how unscrupulous she actually was, and the length she was prepared to go to get what she wanted. It was when I reached the edge of the woods and saw the comforting, pleasing silhouette of Sweetpea Cottage that I smiled contentedly to myself. It would seem this charming little abode had wormed its way into my heart. I could see why Tina loved it so much. I stood there for a brief moment in the trees, staring at the cottage, almost as if I was viewing it for the very first time, like observing a great work of art and just taking it all in. Its whitewashed walls, cast in the lighted shadows of the late morning, were stunning. The tumble of red climbing roses and purple wisteria, winding its way around the front walls of the house and over the red front door, was absolutely enchanting. It was then that I realized to my astonishment that my front door was ajar. I knew I had locked it. Someone was in my cottage. My blood turned icy cold as I stared at my cottage, not believing what I was witnessing. I fumbled around rather awkwardly in the pocket of my jeans for my cell phone. I needed to call the police at once. Someone had broken into my cottage. Then I remembered that my cell phone was charging on the bureau in my bedroom. Damn! I decided to creep up clandestinely to my cottage, with a piece of timber in my hand, to use as a rather futile weapon of self-defence. I had a burning need to know who was in my cottage, and why. As I approached the door very discreetly, I called out loudly, "The police have been called! I've called the police. They're going to be here any moment. Come out now." Of course it was a barefaced lie. But I wanted to unsettle the intruder. I wanted to know who they were. I wanted to call their bluff. But no one came out of the cottage. I imagine that who had ever been in my property had long since left. At first, Sweetpea Cottage looked as if it was an apple pie order, but that was misleading, because when I entered the kitchen, I let out a disembodied scream. There was a large pool of blood all over my kitchen floor. It was grotesque. It looked like a crime scene, as if someone had been murdered in my kitchen. There was blood spatter all over the yellow walls, and it looked menaciously macabre, like something out of a horror movie. And all over the floor were black feathers, parts of a bird, the head, the beak, the body. And there, written in blood all over the wall, in horrifying handwriting, were the huge words, "Get out." All of a sudden, the front door was being opened, and I realized the intruder must have hidden in the cottage. They were not going to get away with this, that was for sure. I could see an ambiguous grey figure in a hoodie dashing through the trees, and I quickly gave him chase. I was so furious that my fear had abandoned me. But whoever was running through the trees could move like the wind. I'd never be able to catch up with them, no matter how hard I tried. I'd always been dreadful at sports in school, and my running ability was less than adequate. It was then that I heard a huge discomposing scream, and a young male voice saying, "Please, please put me down, please." I hightailed it into the woods as fast as I possibly could, and that was when I got the shock of my life. Standing there was a huge male Bigfoot. The creature was real. He was easily over 8 foot tall, possibly more, covered in cinnamon-coloured hair. The thing that startled me the most was how human the creature was. His face reminded me of a noble Indian warrior, and there was intelligence that burned like a blazing fire in his maple syrup-coloured eyes. I didn't feel fear, but complete and total and utter intrigue, and a wondrous awe. But what he was doing baffled me the most. In his hands was swinging the beleaguered figure of Monty Partridge, the son of Sheila Partridge. The young teenager looked absolutely terrified, but he was wearing the grey hoodie that I'd seen escaping from my cottage only moments before. I noticed his brown eyes were round with terror. I couldn't blame him. Anyone would be afraid being manhandled by a Bigfoot. I had a profound sense the Bigfoot had no intention of harming him, that he had stopped my intruder on my behalf, so that I could find out who was actually messing with me. "Please, please put me down," cried the young teenager. He was crying. I'm sure it was not the most comfortable feeling in the world to be in the Bigfoot's arms. In truth, I was struck by the fact that Monty Partridge looked like a doll in the Bigfoot's hands, and for a moment I marvelled at what I was seeing. The Bigfoot's voice boomed. He spoke to me in a strange language. "Dampinakwa hasatalakaniko hilatiba." "He's trying to scare you," he said to me. "He's broken into your house. I've been watching him. He keeps doing it again and again." I realized to my astonishment that I understood the Bigfoot's words. The Bigfoot threw Monty at my feet in disgust, and I found myself staring down at the teenager. It was clear the Bigfoot was not going anywhere. He stood still like a tall, lofty tree, his eyes permanently pinned on Monty Partridge, as if he knew that this young man had a lot of explaining to do. "It was you!" I shrieked at Monty. "How dare you! You put blood all over my kitchen floor! You scared me last night! You put those words all over the wall! Get out in blood! There's blood spatter all over my kitchen walls! How could you do that to me? Do you have any idea how terrified I was? What kind of a weirdo are you?" I grabbed him by the scruff of his collar and shook him violently. He didn't try to run away, nor did he fight back. I think the sight of the Bigfoot watching him had scared the bejesus out of him. "It was you!" I said again and again. "It was you! I can't believe it! I can't believe it! Everything that I've gone through! The television going on and off! It was you, wasn't it?" Tears were now spilling down my cheeks, but more out of anger and infuriation than of fear any more. I found myself slapping him across the face, but he stood there frozen to the spot and did not answer me for a long while, and then he said, "She made me do it. You don't understand what she's like. I'm not sick in the head, I promise you. It was her. She made me do it." "Who made you do what?" I asked. "Please, please make that Bigfoot go. He's scaring me," said the teenager. "I can't talk with him around. He's very cross with me." To my amazement, the Bigfoot appeared to understand everything that was going on, and just glided away, leaving both me and Monty in the wood grove. Monty got up onto his feet, shaking away the leaves and forest dirt that clung to his chinos. His face was as white as paper, and his entire body was shaking like a leaf. I think the Bigfoot had given him a dreadful fright. "That Bigfoot, my God, he's enormous. The most scary thing I've ever seen in my whole life. I thought for a moment he was going to kill me, but he was speaking to me in my head, and he told me to stop messing with you. He seems to be protecting you. Remind me never to mess with you again." "Yes, I think he has been watching out for me, for some reason," I said. "He's been stalking me since I moved here. But I think he was just watching over me and wondering why you were messing around with the cottage. You've been toying with me, but why? I need answers, Monty. Nothing is making any sense. Do you get some kind of warped satisfaction out of scaring people? I mean, where is this coming from? I don't understand. I told you, it's not me. I'm not the one that's sick in the head. It's my mother, said Monty bashfully, unable to hold my inquiring gaze. My mother Sheila wanted me to scare you. She wants you to think that the cottage is haunted. You have no idea what she's like. My mother won't take no for an answer. It was my mother who got a key made for your cottage, so that I could go in and out at will when you were asleep, and switch on the television and mess with the lights. She made me do it. She was the one that made me put the dead raccoon that our Labrador retrieved in the sink, the one with all the maggots in. She wanted to freak you out when you arrived here, so much so that you would be virtually begging her to sell the place for you. She was the one that insisted I made a bloodbath in your kitchen with pig's blood this morning, while you were at Zach's cottage, after our dog found a dead crow in the woods, so that I'd scatter all the feathers around. I thought you'd be gone for much longer. She made me write all over the walls in pig's blood to get out. She so wants you to believe that cottage is haunted, so you'll be desperate to sell. Ah, my word! I can't believe she'd do all that. What is wrong with your mother? She's seriously sick in the head. Why is she so desperate for a commission check? It's absolutely insane.
Monty laughed. This is not about commission. It's much more sinister than that. My mother wants to buy both the cottages from you and Zach at a ridiculously cheap price. She is the one that is going to give you the cheap price for your properties. She intended to give you and Zach a low valuation for your cottage, which is illegal, but that's not going to stop the likes of my mother. She wants to sell this land to a property developer, who will give her a vast fortune for this whole place, which would be life-changing for our family. My mother cannot sell the land until she owns the cottages and the lodge, and then it's all hers. She wants to go and live in the Hamptons, in a place not far to where Gwyneth Paltrow lives, and retire there. My mother's fixated on buying a place there, preferably on the land close to Route 27, close to the ocean, in an expensive neighbourhood, south of the highway, I believe. I looked at Monty incredulously.
But why would you agree to do this for your mother? You know it's wrong. You could be arrested for this. You do realise that?
Monty hung his head in shame. I wish my dad would have the guts to divorce my mother. He should have got rid of her long ago. Both of us are completely under her control. It's pathetic. You have no idea how dominating she is. We both tried to persuade her not to do this, but when my mother wants something, nothing will stop her from achieving her goals.
Thanks for telling me all this, Monty. You can go back home. Don't for God's sake breathe a word of this to your mother. Play her at her own game. Tell her that you did everything she wanted. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this information, but I'm going to think about it long and hard. It's our secret, do you understand?
For the record, I'm really sorry about everything I've done. I really regret it. I haven't enjoyed any of it. I've found it sick and disgusting, and I really apologise.
Monty, your apology is accepted. Your mother put you up to this. This was not your idea. It's her that's got the problem.
You can get her arrested for all I care. I've had enough of my mother. But please don't involve me, and don't involve my dad in any of this. We were not party to my mother's games, he said, walking away through the trees, until he was gone.
1 year later, I stood in the hunting lodge kitchen, staring out of the large windows, unable to believe that so much had happened in a year, and how quickly time had passed, and yet my life had changed exponentially. I barely recognised it any more. The only way I can describe it is being an actress who stars in a very sorry, forlorn part, where everything in her life spirals out of control, and one day the producer gives her a brand new script. She's now playing a new character whose life is pretty close to perfect and not falling precariously apart like a laddered stocking. In truth, I felt like a whole new person in my own life. The old me that had been in a dark place for so long, longer than I cared to remember, had undergone a miraculous metamorphosis. I couldn't believe that I was no longer Freya Frost, but was now Freya Crosscrow. I couldn't remember a time when I felt more happy and contented with my life. The bird with a broken wing could finally fly. But it was another bird with a broken wing, Tina Crosscrow herself, who had given me the quintessential opportunity to find myself again and to find my wings. In me she had recognized a kindred spirit who needed a helping hand, but she had given me so much more than just a helping hand. It was through her incredible kindness that I met her brother Zack, and we had serendipitously fallen in love. So from beyond the grave she had played a Cupid in our lives, and I had been fortunate to meet my sister-in-law, even if our encounter was so brief. It did make me wonder if our paths are already written for us in invisible ink that finally becomes permanent. I was forced to conclude that maybe some things are just meant to be. Who would have believed that my chance fleeting encounter with a random stranger outside a bar would lead not only to my inheriting a cottage, but meeting a man who would ultimately become my husband? Ostensibly my parents in Canada were naturally over the moon that their daughter had finally tied the knot. I believe my withered mother, who felt like a seal tossed around by the waves all the time, was finally able to sleep at night, as her wayward daughter had found some stability in her life, and that brought her a measure of great peace. My sister Rainey was naturally thrilled that I was happily settled in my new life, but I think her husband Thornton could not comprehend what Zack Crosscrow, who was a skilled engineer, would want to have to do with a shop girl like myself, who had sold bras for a living. That man could never take me seriously. He thought, and still thinks, I made of fluff, like candy floss you find at the fair. I even overheard him saying to my sister at our wedding reception, "Zack is a very clever man, who could have any girl he wants. What could he possibly have in common with a shop girl?" At least my sister nudged him and said, "Careful, that's my sister you're talking about." I guess that's the unfortunate way that Thornton will always perceive me, for his fixed view of the world will never be changed. But I don't care what he thinks about me, as his view of me doesn't matter a jot. I think from the moment I met Zack Crosscrow, I could feel there was a spark between us, but I was determined to put it out from the very start. It seemed wrong to be interested in Tina Crosscrow's brother. I guess you could say it was the scandalous course of events instigated by the duplicity of Sheila Partridge that flung both me and Zack together, as we pondered how anyone could be so vindictive and spiteful. So we hatched a plan of our very own. Sheila Partridge must sell the hunting lodge at a good price to us, or we would go to the police with all our evidence about how she conspired to defraud us. And to my amazement, both husband and son were willing to testify against her on our behalf. I'll never forget the look on Sheila's face when she realized the cat had finally come out of the bag, and that her clandestine, guileful deeds were now nakedly exposed. "I can't think what on earth you're talking about, Freya. You're talking absolute nonsense," she said, looking at me with a befuddled expression on her face that I didn't buy for a second. "I told you, did I not, that your cottage is haunted? Those strange things you're talking about have happened to you as a result of the haunting. They have absolutely nothing to do with me. I did not want to mention this to you, but when Tina Crosscrow was alive, she would tell me about these idiosyncratic occurrences in the cottage. She knew the place was haunted and was terribly frightened by the bizarre events." "I'll say one thing for you, Sheila," said Zack. "You're an excellent, very convincing liar. But we don't buy a word you're saying," he said, growling at her contemptuously. "The cottage was never ever haunted. You know that, I know that, and Tina knew that. If she'd thought as much, she would almost certainly have confided in me. She never liked you very much, Sheila, never trusted you. You're the last person she would have confided in. You and I well know that Sweet Pea Cottage was never ever haunted, but you wanted to make it appear that way, to suit your own ends." "Mrs. Partridge, we know all about your duplicitous plans, and you've certainly got some explaining to do. I caught your son Monty in the act of trashing my cottage, and he told me everything about your intention of buying our cottages from me and Zack at a steal. Your gluttonous plans were to sell this land to some developer who'd give you a huge price for this property, so you could buy yourself a dream place in the Hamptons, a house not very far from where Gwyneth Paltrow lives, am I right? That's what you wanted for yourself. I bet you were hoping that you and Gwyneth Paltrow could become bosom buddies and hang out together. You didn't care about how low you had to stoop to get what you wanted. You were ruthlessly aggressive in your attempts to scare me out of my cottage. There's something very sick about you, Mrs. Partridge. What you did was absolutely deplorable. You got your own son to put pig's blood all over my kitchen wall, and to write "Get out" in blood, and to leave blood spatter all over my kitchen floor, and birds' feathers and body parts all over the place. My cottage looked like a macabre crime scene. You got a key for my cottage made for you, so that you could get your son to access my cottage, to play games with the electrics, bang on the door in the middle of the night, scare the bejesus out of me. Your son didn't want to do any of these things, but he's so scared of you, Mrs. Partridge, that he did it on your behalf. It's disgusting you made him do all this stuff. This time it was Angus Partridge who was absolutely furious. He regarded his wife through narrowed eyes. You got our son, Monty, to put pig's blood all over the walls of Freya's cottage. How sick are you, Sheila? I'm completely outraged. I've had enough of your vindictive games. I want nothing more to do with you, woman. He glowered. You seriously need help. I never thought you were capable of stooping this low. I always knew you were a treacherous woman. But this time you've gone too far. I want a divorce as soon as possible, he said. Now that you know what your husband wants from you, Mrs. Partridge, I will tell you what we want, said Zack, taking my hand in his. Me and Freya want you to sell the hunting lodge to us at a decent price, or we will go to the police ourselves and inform them about your intentional plan to defraud us on the cottages. Furthermore, I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about your insidious macabre stunts you pulled on Freya, your trespassing on her property. Imagine what it would do to your reputation if all this stuff about you got out. We could see that Sheila was defeated. She was like a deer caught in headlights. Very well, I will sell you the lodge at a good price, as long as I have your word that you will not inform the police or any of the locals about this. I have my reputation at the agency to consider. As for a divorce, she said, looking at Angus in disgust, you are welcome to one, Angus. Do you really think I was going to share a place in the Hamptons with you? Of course not. No, I intended to spit you out with the bath-water. I have never had any respect for you, my darling, she said callously, with no injection of remorse in her tone. You were always so pathetic. You let me walk all over you because you have no backbone. You're completely spineless. You honestly expected me to respect you for that. And you have the audacity to call yourself a man. What a joke, she said snidely. As for you, Monty, you're a chip off the old block, aren't you? Not only have I got a pathetic husband, but a pathetic son as well. 2 birds of a feather you both are. And I'm very happy to finally see the back of you both. I hope to never see you again. Don't you worry. You can have your divorce. I intended to let you go anyway. Good riddance to bad rubbish as far as I'm concerned. Now that you've said your piece, Sheila, I'd like you to leave this premises, said Zack, or I shall call the police myself. Angus and Monty can stay here at the lodge as long as they like, until it's finally been sold to us, he said, putting his arm around me tenderly. Me and Freya have decided to get married, so we want to live here at the lodge. But you barely know each other, said Sheila, looking horrified. That girl over there is probably marrying you to get her hands on this place.
You can't trust a woman like her. I mean, she managed to get your sister to give her cottage, for goodness sake. She's a very treacherous girl, I can bet you that. Sometimes you just know when it's right, said Zack, kissing me tenderly on the cheek. And for the record, Sheila, we're not all wired like you are.
We watched with a measure of satisfaction, Sheila being escorted off our property. We never did see her again. She sold the hunting lodge to us as she promised. She also sold her agency and moved out of town forthwith, as she was probably terrified that word would get out about her insane behaviour, but it never did, for we kept stum. The money from Sheila's divorce was divided between both her and her husband. I know she never got that house in the Hamptons that she wished for. Angus and Monty bought the White Swan from us. These days they have almost reinvented themselves. They now work for us full-time, helping around our property, as we have transformed the hunting lodge back to a thriving business, and we can have over 15 guests staying at the lodge at one time, in both summer and winter. The lodge is also used for other outdoor pursuits, like horse riding and fishing, so Angus and Monty do their part in making our guests feel warmly welcome. When I told Zack about the Bigfoot I'd encountered, he was incredulous. Monty affirmed that when he tried to escape from Sweet Pea Cottage, from doing his mother's bidding with the pig's blood and dead crow, a huge Bigfoot had grabbed him by the scruff of the collar. I've never been so terrified in my whole life. The thing was enormous, and it was furious with me. I thought it was going to kill me. I really did. Then I realised it was being protective towards Freya. Come to think of it, every time I'd go to Sweet Pea Cottage to pull a stunt, one thing or another, like messing with the electrics or something, I could swear I was being followed to the cottage, but nothing was ever there. I was really spooked. Now I know all the time that Bigfoot was watching me. He wanted to protect Freya. He knew I was up to no good. It's funny you should say that, said Zack. Tina used to confide in me that she always felt incredibly safe because a large male Bigfoot was watching over her cottage and keeping her safe. I thought it was all in her imagination, but I called her bluff. She called him the Watcher. She said she could go to bed at night with all the lights switched off because the Watcher was out there taking care of her. She said the Watcher would walk around the cottage at night to ensure she was absolutely safe. She told me once she had met the Watcher in the woods, who told her he'd always watch over her. In truth, I thought it was in her head, but it must have been true. It is true, I said. He's been watching over me as well. He wanted me to know that no one would ever scare me again. I believe he's out there, watching over the premises, watching over us to keep us safe. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, isn't that an incredible story? I don't know what to say. As far as Mrs. Partridge is concerned, what an appalling woman. She'd stop at nothing to get that girl to leave the cottage. But isn't it incredible how Tina Crosscrow crossed Freya's path and how she ended up inheriting this incredible cottage and she ended up meeting the man of her dreams. What a romantic story. But also, what an awful woman Mrs. Partridge was. Oh, what a fabulous story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Until next time, goodbye and good night.